Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again. I am broadcasting to you from the great state of Colorado. And tonight I'm going to be reviewing a book that I finished up over the past couple of weeks. It is called Debating the Text of the Word of God, and it is a debate between Douglas Wilson and James White. So to kind of set the scene here for what the book is about, it is basically about what the New Testament text should be, what the underlying New Testament text for translations should be. And the 2 point of views that are put forward is, you have Wilson on one side arguing that the text for the New Testament should be the Textus Receptus, the received text, the text that was popular, during the Reformation. And then on the other side, you have James White defending what is commonly called the critical text, like the Nestle Aland 28th edition or the United Bible Society's 5th edition, something along those lines. And that's the basic premise, and unfortunately, this book is not worth the paper that it's printed on, as far as I'm concerned. It is a matter that, frankly, deserves a lot more discussion than you get here. As you can see, it is an extremely thin book. It's just a little over 100 pages long, and there's not really enough space in there for either side to really drill down into anything of any great import. Very, very basic, very, very superficial. There's just not a lot there. This sells, I think it's like for $8.99 on Amazon, and like I said, it's not worth the paper that is printed on. It just doesn't go into enough detail to be useful to anyone. If you're looking to defend either position, this book is not going to give you enough detail in order to do that. Will it get some conversation started? Probably. Is it going to give anyone useful information regarding those conversations? Not at all. But it is a debate, though. It is a written debate between two Christians, two Reformed Christians, about an issue that a lot of people consider very important. What text you read out of for your Bible is going to have an impact on you. And as a lot of people know, there are some verses in the New Testament that are debated between different versions and between different versions in English. And so it is a significant issue. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether or not this was the best format to do it in, and frankly, I'm not convinced. But since it is a debate, it's worthwhile talking about who the winner was and who the loser was. I'm a little bit cautious on calling either one the winner, just because this does not really give a whole lot of information on either side, and so it's not like either side just roundly proved their point. But one thing that did happen that is very clear is that one side did completely fall flat on their face. The other side might not technically have won as far as being able to give overwhelming evidence, but the other side did a complete faceplant. And the side that did the complete faceplant was Douglas Wilson. And granted, he was at a bit of a disadvantage in this because he was going up against James White, who has done textual scholarship many times over, has done a lot of study in that area, and it became very obvious in reading the book that this is not something that Douglas Wilson has gotten into in significantly great depth. And that became obvious really quick, so he was definitely out of his element. But there's plenty of times where he basically takes the grenade, as it were, he pulls the pin, and then he drops it at his feet and says, "Deal with that." And James White just kind of sits back and says, "Okay, yeah, go for it." James White doesn't really have to do a lot in it, just because Wilson kind of creates his own self-refuting arguments. Now, of course, if you don't know anything about textual criticism, you might not know that they're self-refuting arguments, but they are. Going through the entire book, of course, would not be practical for a video review, but there are 3 pages that I wanted to look at with you that have to deal with Wilson and the kinds of things that he brings up that he thinks proves his point. But like I said, it's really just him dropping a grenade at his own feet and thinking that somehow he's going to destroy the enemy with it. All right, so on page 20. On page 20, Wilson is opening up his point of view, explaining, basically why he believes that we should use the Textus Receptus. And these are a couple of paragraphs that are in there. Starting about the middle of the page, he says, "But while we are prevented from getting any closer to the headwaters," he's talking about how far back in history we can go with the textual evidence that we have. He says, "But while we are prevented from getting any closer than this to the headwaters, we can still draw some inferences about it. The Alexandrian River," because these are the two that he puts up against each other. By the way, the modern critical text is not just Alexandrian. Just letting you know, it's very strongly Alexandrian, but it's not only Alexandrian, but Douglas Wilson paints it as if it was. He says, "We can draw some inferences about it. The Alexandrian River, 300 miles from the headwaters," I guess for him 100 miles represents a century basically, 300 miles from the headwaters is 100 yards wide. The Textus Receptus River, and he's going to do some equivocation here, the Textus Receptus River, 400 miles from the headwaters, is a mile wide. Now, a mile-wide river is not going to have its headwaters just a couple of bends upstream. What this tells us is that the Byzantine River goes back at least as far as the Alexandrian River does. The issue is not antiquity. Both text types are undeniably ancient. I would argue that they are plainly on equal footing in this regard. That was confusing, to say the least, and frankly, it was intentionally so. Douglas Wilson was not trying to make his point clear here. What he was trying to do was to make things as confusing as possible to dazzle his readers. And that's all that this book ultimately winds up being. This is propaganda for Wilson. This is Wilson coming back into the world saying, "I am Wilson, hear me roar." It wasn't meant to be understood. But the basic argument behind what he's saying there is that there's the stream, there's these different text types, and one text type has so much more in it than the other one does, and that tells us that it goes back at least as far as the other one because there's so much more manuscript evidence. It's a terrible argument. That's not what it means. There's all kinds of ways in which you can have a manuscript tradition that has lots of manuscripts, but it's not original. We see that in Islam, for example, with Khalif Uthman. Uthman's recension of the text winds up becoming the standard version of the text. Now, did anyone see a text like Khalif Uthman's before Khalif Uthman revised the text, rescinded the text? Not as far as we can tell. But after his recension, guess what? It basically became the law of the land. So guess what's going to happen? It's going to become the dominant position that's out there. Just because that's what people decide to use after that point. It doesn't mean that it was original. It doesn't mean it goes back to the original in any significant detail that would be pertinent to the debate. So, bad, faulty logic on there, but this is his claim. There's this one family of manuscripts that's really, really broad, and the other one's really small, so we should use the really broad one. And he switches on what he calls them. He says Textus Receptus is the broad one, and then he calls it the Byzantine text, and those are not the same thing. The Textus Receptus is actually technically a subset of the Byzantine text. The Textus Receptus itself is actually a really, really, really small sliver. It's actually probably just as small, if not smaller, than the Alexandrian stream. Now, the Byzantine text as a whole, of course, is much wider. But they're not the same thing. Douglas Wilson, though, in this paragraph, he uses them interchangeably. That's an equivocation fallacy, which is something that I would not expect a Christian scholar who values honesty and truth to use. And then into the second paragraph, it just gets ridiculous. He says, if we take the 9th century for a cutoff point, we have 6 manuscripts which belong to the Byzantine family. In contrast, the Alexandrian has the testimony of 9 surviving uncials. Complicating matters a bit, the earliest of these manuscripts, Codex Alexandrinus, is Byzantine in the Gospels and Alexandrian elsewhere. In other words, at that particular point, there was a confluence of the rivers. So there it is, 6 to 9. So why do I use the illustration of a mile-wide river and a much narrower river? Once we move from the all-caps uncials to the newer style of minuscule text, over 80% of all the manuscripts represent the Byzantine text. And over the course of all manuscript history prior to the invention of printing, there are thousands of manuscripts. Again, Douglas Wilson is not being as clear as he could be on this, but what he's basically done here is, like I said, he dropped a grenade at his own 2 feet and thought that it was proof. He says we have 6 Byzantine manuscripts, which he's arguing go with the Textus Receptus, to 9 Alexandrian manuscripts, which would mean that there was more, from his way of judging it, more Alexandrian manuscripts than Byzantine manuscripts. So why does he, early on, so why is it that he is convinced that we should go with the Byzantine as well? Because much later on, after the 9th century, the Byzantine text becomes more popular. But for the first 9 centuries, it's clearly in the minority. And what he's done here is very interesting, because when he says there are just this many manuscripts and this many manuscripts that support it, he's limiting it to basically complete manuscripts. But anyone who knows the New Testament manuscripts knows that the vast majority of them are not complete New Testaments. In fact, only about 1% of all Greek New Testament manuscripts are of the the entire New Testament, or at least a significant portion thereof within a couple of books. So he's artificially limiting his numbers down. He's not willing to consider any of the papyri or partial manuscripts. He's limiting it just to the major codices, and even then it's not in his favor, so he has to appeal to something that's in the future. His winding logic, which isn't really logic, is just replete through all of his answers. There is no coherent argument that he's making. He's, like I said, he's committing all of these logical fallacies, showing that he has no idea what he's talking about and that he cannot make a coherent argument, and he has destroyed his own credibility as far as I'm concerned. We should use the Byzantine text because it's more popular, but it wasn't more popular to begin with, it was more popular later. But that proves that it was the one that was there at the beginning. No, it doesn't. You, in fact, just disproved your own points. The Alexandrian text was the one that was more popular at the beginning, even when you restrict it down to just major complete texts. When you go to just the codices and you don't do the papyri and those kinds of things. And if you go to the papyri and all the other manuscripts, then guess what? Early on, before the 9th century, the vast majority of the texts are non-Byzantine, a good many of them being Alexandrian. In fact, early on, the Alexandrian text is the majority text. Now, like I said, he pulls the pin, drops it at his feet, and says, "I've done a good job." Ridiculous. But what I did find interesting in there is that he admits that the earliest manuscript for the Byzantine text type, which is not the same as Textus Receptus, but he admits that the earliest manuscript for the Byzantine text type is Codex Alexandrinus. And just to quote it again, he says, "Complicating matters a bit, the earliest of these manuscripts, Codex Alexandrinus, is Byzantine in the Gospels and Alexandrian elsewhere." Okay, I want you to keep that in mind, because when we move further on to questions and answers, this actually becomes relevant again. So first of all, to begin with, Wilson does not make any coherent arguments. He artificially reduces data that's available. He commits equivocation fallacies. All kinds of things that just get in the way of actually understanding what the issue is. And then when it comes to the questions and answers, which is much more so towards the end of the book, this is from page 72, it comes back to bite him. So on page 72, he is asked a question. And I believe this is a question that Dr. White gave him. Yep, White examines Wilson. Okay, so here's the question. It's question 3, by the way. It's on page 72. White says, "You asserted," he's talking to Wilson, he says, "you asserted the same providential process that gave us the Gospel of John, gave us the pericope adulterae." That is the woman caught in adultery. "Though it appears in Luke in some manuscripts. How can your providential theory ever recognize any inappropriate addition by a later scribe that simply becomes popular in a particular area?" So this is what White is asking. He's saying, okay, you believe that basically because it came down to you and it was used by the reformers, that means that it was right. It was providentially preserved. So how would your theory account for things that were incorrectly preserved? Can your theory actually see things that would be incorrectly preserved? This is Wilson's response. he says, it seems to me that this would be structurally a simple problem to solve. If you had a later manuscript with such an episode in it, with an alteration and with an addition in it that it's not supposed to have, one way to discover a problem would be through finding an earlier manuscript in the same manuscript family that didn't have it. That would be one way. So what he's saying is, well, what we could do is we could look at a particular manuscript family that we would like, and if early members of that family don't have this particular thing in it, then that means it was a later edition. Now, his favorite text type is the Byzantine text, which he conflates with the Textus Receptus, even though they're not exactly the same thing. But he prefers the Byzantine text and argues, for this larger manuscript base. And he says that if there are earlier manuscripts that are a part of that don't have particular things in them, then that's a good indication that those things were added. And White specifically asked him about the Pericope Adulterae. But remember back at the beginning on page 20 that we just read, he admitted that Codex Alexandrinus was Byzantine in the Gospels. And guess what Codex Alexandrinus does not have? This is a copy of the United Bible Society's 5th edition here. And I'm trying to show you the textual apparatus here. Okay, good. And I hate working with this camera sometimes. Okay, so I know it's a little bit fuzzy. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, so here's the variants at 753 through 811. This is the woman cotton adultery. And you notice that the critical text wants to omit it. And part of that evidence over here is A. I don't know how well you guys can see that. But that A is Codex Alexandrinus. It omits the woman caught in adultery. And Wilson already admitted that in the Gospels it's Byzantine. So what does that mean? Well, by Wilson's own standard that he just gave to James White, if you find a manuscript that doesn't have it earlier that's in the same family, well, then that proves that it isn't authentic. He already admitted that it was a part of the Byzantine family in the Gospels. It clearly does not have it. That is, that particular portion actually isn't extant, but based on the line lengths, you can calculate it out, and it doesn't have enough space for the Pericope Adulterae in it. So it is a witness against the Pericope Adulterae, which is why it's therefore omitting it. So guess what that means? It was not a part of the early Byzantine tradition. It was added later to the Byzantine tradition, which means that by Wilson's standard that he just gave White, it shouldn't be there. And yet Wilson defends the Pericope Adulterae, even though by his own standard it shouldn't be in there. And this is the problem with people who are TR only or ecclesiastical text only or whatever you want to call them, is that when they defend their position, they can never be consistent. If you apply what they say over here to something over here, it winds up circumventing themselves. And we just saw that, page 20. Codex Alexandrinus is Byzantine in the Gospels. Page 72. Well, early manuscripts that don't have it from this particular text family would prove that it's a later edition. Well, then it's not authentic, but he still argues that it is, and that it should be retained. It's completely ridiculous. He flat out contradicts himself. He's his own prosecutor. He's his own witness against himself. He testifies against himself in court. Like I said, pulled the pen, dropped it at his feet, and said, there you go. Stupid, stupid, stupid. And then not too much later, on page 74, he decides to dazzle us with his brilliance about how we need to look at the Comma Johanneum. Okay, so John 7:53 through 8:11 is the Pericope Adulterae. It's about the woman caught in adultery. Wilson defends that very inconsistently. Very inconsistently. You know that manuscript that I mentioned beforehand that's Byzantine? That one actually works against me here, and I said that using it would actually be a valid argument for the non-inclusion, but I still argue for the inclusion. Yeah, like that. And then he decides to go on to the Comma Johanneum, which is basically 1 John 5:7. And he decides to present us with a sketch of a defense for retaining this passage. This is what he says. This is Wilson. He says, what follows is the merest sketch of such a defense. First, removing that verse creates a grammatical difficulty. John uses spirit, water, and blood, which are all neuter. But verse 8 treats them as masculine. If the comma is retained, there is no problem. So this is the first bit of evidence that Wilson outlines for us, and if he had bothered to do any critical studying on this subject, he would know that there are places in the Greek New Testament where the genders do not match, and yet the different components are related to each other. A good example of this is Matthew 23:23. Now, most of the time in the Greek, where things match up, it means that they are indeed connected to each other. And I talked about this in one of my previous videos when I was talking about 2 Peter 3:9. 2 Peter 3:9, there's some pronouns that match up as much as they possibly can. Humas technically is missing one of the qualifiers that it could have, but on all of the ones that it can have, it matches other things in the text, which tells us that they're all related. However, just because they're different doesn't necessarily mean that they're unrelated. And there are places in the New Testament that are like that. Matthew 23:23 is a good example. So at the best, Wilson's argument is non-definitive. It could be associated or it could not be associated. It doesn't prove a thing at all. So his first line of evidence that he puts forward is one that is not conclusive. And one that has been responded to many times, and people have pointed out that that isn't necessarily a rule like he wants it to be. There are texts in the New Testament itself where people agree these things are related, even though the genders don't agree. That does happen. Then he moves on. Second, if verse 7 is an interpolation, included for the sake of Trinitarian polemics, it is hard to explain why the insertion would be the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. If your point was to defend the traditional formula, it is odd to veer from that formula. And this is, again, where Wilson shows that he is completely ignorant of what's going on. The argument that people make regarding the Comma Johanneum is that if it was authentic, it would have been used in the great Trinitarian controversies of the 4th century. It doesn't show up in any of those conversations, though, because it wasn't there. But it doesn't show up in them. So the arguments that people use is that it wasn't ever used in those kinds of ways. It was never originally used as a defense of the Trinity. So it's not surprising that it doesn't use a normal Trinitarian formula. In fact, the first time that it shows up is in a Western Church Father who happens to be a heretic. You wouldn't exactly expect him to use traditional formulas if he's a heretic. And that's the first place that it shows up. No one ever claimed that this text originated as a defense of the Trinity in the heyday of the Trinitarian controversies. No one claims that. But Wilson pretends that it is, because he either A, has not done any significant reading in the field, or B, he's waving at people. Hey, look at this over here that has nothing to do with the issue at hand. Woohoo, I answered a question that nobody asked. I refuted a claim that no one makes. This is poor argumentation on a phenomenal level. And yet there's lots of people who really look up to Douglas Wilson. Why? I cannot imagine. He's an idiot when it comes to his form of argumentation. We've already seen his inconsistency. We've already seen that he uses conflation of terms, that he commits equivocation fallacies, and those kinds of things. And then on top of that, he uses basically red herring. The red herring fallacy. Oh, there's this thing over here. Look at that. Look at that. I answered this question that no one raised. All right, and then, last but not least, third, a common scribal error is called homoioteliaton. A scribe easily could have looked at "there are three that bear witness," glanced up to take a cup of coffee from a colleague, which of course the scribes wouldn't have that then, and returned to his work, where his eye fell on the identical phrase in verse 8. He went to bed that night and slept soundly. What does all that mean? Again, Wilson has not making any great attempts to be clear at all. But what he's basically saying is that what happened is that in the traditional text, which is what I have over here on the right, there's a couple of phrases that are similar, and perhaps what happened is the scribe's eye jumped from one of those to the other, and he just skipped the in-between material. So here are the identical words. There's the marturuntes en, and then down here in verse 8, you also have the marturuntes in. Hen. Sorry, it's been a while since I read Greek. I'm getting a little rusty. I need to go back and refresh myself. Marturuntes in. Anyways, what he's basically saying is that the scribe got done copying this part, went off and did something else, probably was not a cup of coffee, just saying, and then he looked back at his text and saw this particular part here that has the same phrase as this one, and he thought it was the same thing, and so he starts copying from after that. There's a huge problem with this, though. In the text that's debated, this little phrase here that follows that would be included. Homoioteliaton would only explain this if it could erase this phrase as well, because that's a part of the variant. But homoioteliaton only covers the parts that are the same. Those parts right there. So it is that part of the text right there that would get cut off. The tege on earth would be left if this was a case of homoioteliaton. But guess what? There is no manuscript that omits just the blue portion. Nope. Instead, that is the portion that is omitted. There are three which bear witness: the spirits, and the water, and the blood. It does not have the tege in there, but that is what would be required if Douglas Wilson's claim is correct. His does not account for the tege. Everyone who studied this in detail knows that this is not a case of homoioteliaton because it picks the wrong parts to eliminate. So it cannot be homoioteliaton. Okay, this is not a variant. There is no manuscript out there, no Greek manuscript out there that has this particular reading that Douglas's claim would require. This is either complete ignorance of what is actually out there, or maybe he's basing it on English translation. Even then, a lot of English translations still render it in order. There are three that bear witness in heaven. There are three that bear witness on earth. He would know that those parts still have to be accounted for. So at best, this is just simple ignorance, in which case he's saying, hey, look at me, I'm a scholar, I know absolutely nothing. Or it is a willful misrepresentation. Either case, as a Christian, I don't have any respect for him. I hold Christians to higher standards than that. Did Dr. White do a good job of defending the position for the critical text? Frankly, not as well as I would have liked. Like I said, the book is a really thin book. There's not a lot of time to develop anything on either side. So yeah, I'm not really impressed with what Dr. White was able to do. But I'm much more disappointed in Douglas Wilson, because like I said, Douglas Wilson pulled the pin, dropped the grenade at his feet, and exploded. Hey, this was not a serious, in-depth conversation. This was Douglas Wilson finding a way to get his name out there. And that's exactly what he did. Are the arguments good? No. Most of Douglas Wilson's arguments are so completely fallacious, it's not even funny. It's sad that a Christian would resort to these kinds of things in conversation with another Christian. This kind of thing should not be happening among Christians, and especially not with unbelievers either. But Christians just in general should not be acting like this. You should not be resorting to logical fallacies to make your point. If your point cannot stand up to the text of consistent definitions and consistent application of standards, avoiding red herrings, and accurate representation of the facts, which his claim that it was homoioteliaton with 1 John 5:7 does not match, Douglas Wilson has done some good things for Christianity in general, but I have great concern for anyone who will look to him as a great standard of truth. Because if there's anything that this little book brought out, it's that Douglas Wilson is not interested in truth. He likes to promote himself. That's what this was about. And unfortunately, Dr. White played along and let him get away with it. Dr. White should not have even engaged in this, as far as I'm concerned. This was a case where Dr. White got involved in something that he shouldn't have, as far as I'm concerned. He gave someone who is not a respectable, honorable Christian a platform to perpetuate their Christian idiocy. And now, I think Dr. White was hoping that he maybe could present a little bit of balance, address the issues that are out there. I think that his intentions were fairly benign. But after looking at the final form of the book, of the debate that resulted, all that happened is that Wilson got his name out there. There wasn't enough space for a significant discussion on either side. It just didn't turn out that way. Like I said at the beginning, this book is not worth the paper that it's printed on. Okay, if you're looking to get good resources on the issue from the point of view of the ecclesiastical text position or the critical text position, don't go to this book. Now, frankly, I'm not aware of any good books out there on the ecclesiastical text position, because a lot of them, they can't do any better than Wilson. They employ a lot of logical fallacies. They cannot be consistent with beans. They misrepresent data, do not account for all of the facts, so on and so forth. Okay, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that this is a great book for the other side either. It's just not. Okay, so is it worth the time and money? Personally, I would not say so. All that it shows is that Wilson found a way to get his name out there and is really, really, really good at displaying his incompetence for anyone who actually knows the field in any kind of depth. And frankly, I'm not an expert. I don't have a degree in this. My degree is in math and English education. But even to me, it's obvious that these kinds of arguments just simply are invalid. They're easy to refute. If the book had had more space for a rebuttal, White would have been able to do an awesome job refuting him. Because like I said, that's what Wilson does. He pulls the pin, drops it at his own feet, and all that White would have had to done is just, put up a blast shield and let it explode. But the book is so small, he never got around to that. It's a useless book that way. So that's my opinion on the matter. Thank you for listening. For those of you who are in Christ and actually take the name of Christ seriously and representing the truth seriously, go with God and be blessed. But for those of you who are not, including those of you who are dishonest in the name of Christ, who are inconsistent in the name of Christ, I pray that you would understand the true Christ of history, the one who values truth, so that you may actually have true salvation. Because a false Christ, one that is not true, and one that would perpetuate falsehoods, cannot save you. Amen.